Hi everyone. I want to take this opportunity to talk about some of the trends in supply chain management. I will reiterate some of the ones we've already talked about and then talk about some trends that we haven't discussed. I want to make sure, given that this is an intro supply chain management class, that these things are apparent to you, and I realize they're not going to be blatantly obvious to you as you're just discovering what you're majoring in. So I'm going to repeat myself a little bit, and hopefully by doing so, it really starts to sink in. I mentioned previously that a trend is to move away from being highly vertically integrated, simply meaning you do everything yourself from beginning to end, to outsourcing. So companies have started to outsource their commodity needs. They've moved beyond that and started to outsource their core critical needs and stuff that's a little more strategic. And now they're starting to outsource entire functional areas where supply chain management itself has become their core competency because they outsource so much of what they need and what they do. The end result is they have to be very good at managing their suppliers. And if they're not, they're going to put themselves at a competitive disadvantage in the marketplace. So the other trend I want to talk about is not only are companies outsourcing more and more of their material needs, they're trying to do so by outsourcing more and more to a fewer and fewer and fewer number of suppliers. And there are a number of reasons for this. First and foremost, it drives down costs. When you give suppliers larger and larger amounts of business and volumes, what's expected in return is per unit costs or cost savings or price discounts. The reason for that is you're giving suppliers economies of scale. So if you give them business to make one part and then 100, then 1,000, and then 1,000,000, they should be learning things during that time period to do things better, faster, and cheaper. So by awarding suppliers larger and larger amounts of business, in other words, giving them larger and larger amounts of volume, while at the same time outsourcing more and more of your needs, hopefully that's creating economies of scale, and that results in productivity gains and learning curve effects that result in cost savings for both the supplier, of which is shared with the customer or the buying organization. I got this question rather recently. We talked about commodities, for which several suppliers exist to choose from. Highly competitive, tends to be very saturated in terms of competition. The margins tend to be thin for these suppliers. What's a good margin? In other words, if you're doing business with a supplier and they give you a cost breakdown, or if you think you know what your supplier's margins are, what would you be comfortable with as a customer or buying organization? And the answer to that question is, well, it depends. Personally, if I worked for a company and I was a buyer and I was buying stuff from suppliers, I wouldn't be thrilled to know that my suppliers have better margins than I do myself at my own company. So if my company sells something for $1 and we make 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 cents on the dollar, in other words, we have single-digit margins, I wouldn't be thrilled if my suppliers were making, say, 10, 20, 30, 40 cents on the dollar, in other words, double-digit margins on doing business with me. But it all depends. Obviously, if you have a supplier in a saturated industry that has tons of competition, and you're literally just handing them blueprints and you're saying, make this, I've done all the design work for you, yeah, I think it's reasonable to assume that the margins on that kind of business should be thinner and smaller than if you tell a supplier, look, you're the expert, I want you to do most of the design work for me. I'll give you these black box specifications, which means I'll give you general form fit data and criteria, and then you work around that. For example, it'll go here in the product that I build. The rest I want you to do in terms of design. In other words, you're telling the supplier, you're the expert, you do this for a living, I want to tap into your design skills so you build in the specifications versus me doing it and then just handing you a blueprint. I think in that situation, it would be reasonable for the supplier to expect better margins, but it all depends. I will say this, the other advantage of outsourcing more and more of your material needs to a fewer and fewer number of suppliers is what's implied by that is not only are you giving your suppliers greater economies of scale to generate cost savings for both them and you, but you're also managing a fewer and fewer number of suppliers. So you can have better relationships with them, you can nurture them, you can develop them, you can do long-term business with them, you can make them a strategic partner. It's easier to do that if most of your spend and your outsourcing is with a fewer number of suppliers than a larger number of suppliers. The other trend has been When buying organizations award suppliers business, in the past, typically those businesses would be short term, and then they would have those suppliers rebid on the business a year or two later. Now, a lot of buying organizations are saying, I'm giving this business to you, and as long as you keep doing things better, faster, and cheaper, and share that with us, in particular the cost savings, they tell them you've got the business for a long time, for the long term, if not for the lifetime of the product or for the lifetime of our existence. So what you're basically saying is, supplier, I'm giving you an incentive to make investments in yourself and in doing business with us, because the reward will be, if you do that, you'll get long-term business. When suppliers were only given the business for 1 year, if they thought there was a chance that they wouldn't get the business long-term, in other words, they wouldn't get it beyond the 1 year contract, they might not make the investments to do things better, faster, and cheaper in the business they do with you as the customer. So that's been a major trend, is the days of short-term contracts and annual contracts is kind of behind us. Now back to outsourcing a larger amount of business to a fewer and fewer number of suppliers. The other advantage of that is it's easier to manage a few suppliers versus a bunch of suppliers. So a lot of the OEMs in more mature industries like automotive, farm equipment, heavy equipment, steel, aerospace, chemical, if you really look at their sourcing strategy, it's very similar to what we've discussed already in class. It's very aggressive on the outsourcing side. They outsource almost everything they need. But if you really look at their total spend and what they outsource, almost all of their spend and the dollar value of what they outsource is with a few very large companies. Okay, back to what would be reasonable margins with suppliers. I think a big part of that is leverage. Most of you will get jobs in buying organizations where the company you work for is much, much larger than the suppliers you do business with. That in itself would imply that you're going to have some leverage during the negotiation process. So in those situations, what's implied by that is if you're much larger than your supplier and you're a major customer for your supplier, that sort of leverage would imply that their margins aren't going to be too unreasonable, right? Because you've got the leverage. So now the trend is doing business with a fewer and fewer number of suppliers, and the end result is a lot of the companies that you're going to work for are going to be outsourcing their material needs, both for commodities and core critical strategic needs, to what are very, very large suppliers and companies, but they're usually not bigger than the company that you work for. Okay, so let me give you some examples. In mature industries like automotive, steel, space, aerospace, about ballpark here, 90% of their total spend, 90% of the dollar value of everything that they outsource is with around 100 suppliers or less, and sometimes it's less than 50, and sometimes it's less than 20. Think about what I just said there. The large OEMs in mature industries, a lot of which recruit from our program, they outsource almost everything. Almost everything they outsource isn't with 3,000 suppliers, it's with around 100, 50, 20 different suppliers. So in essence, you're only managing a few suppliers. So let's say you have $250 million in spend. You're probably not managing 2,000 different suppliers, because that would be impossible. You're probably managing 3 or 4 or 5, or maybe at the most 10, of which they account for about 90% or more of your total spend. So obviously, it is easier to manage a fewer number of suppliers and establish these long-term strategic alliances and relationships versus if you had to manage 300 or 3,000 different suppliers. So back to, say, automotive, if a company like GM or Ford outsources $100 billion a year in direct material purchases, I'll bet you over $80–90 billion of that amount is with 100 suppliers or fewer. What do those suppliers look like if they're getting, say, $90 billion a year in spend from GM and Ford alone? They're huge. These are typically publicly held companies. You can buy stocks in them, and they tend to be huge. They employ thousands of people and do billions annually in sales revenue, okay? So how much leverage do companies like John Deere, Boeing, Harley Davidson, Honda, GM, Ford, Chrysler have? How much leverage do they have if 90% of everything that they source is with 100 or fewer suppliers, of which are very, very large companies. Furthermore, if you look at these suppliers, yeah, they're probably smaller than these OEM customers, but they're not small, they're huge. Furthermore, these suppliers do business across industries with a number of different customers. They have very diversified customer and product portfolios, meaning for a lot of these suppliers, if they do business with GM, yes, GM is a big, important customer, but it's probably not 25, 50, or 75% of their business. So the point I'm making is a lot of the OEMs that you're going to end up working for, as they pursue driving down costs and managing a fewer number of suppliers, they've taken away a little bit of their leverage, because in the process of doing that, they're doing business with suppliers that account for most of their spend, that are really, really big companies that won't necessarily be strong-armed during the negotiation process. So let's say these OEMs want to reopen contracts because they're in a recession and stuff's not selling and the margins are thin and tight. And they say stuff like, I just want to hack away at your margins and put you through the competitive bidding process, or I just want to negotiate a lower price without doing anything that helps you reduce your direct costs. In other words, I'm just here to mess with your margins. I'm here to nickel and dime you. A lot of these big suppliers that account for most of the spend at these large OEMs are not responsive to that, and they don't necessarily need to be, because these OEMs aren't necessarily their biggest, most important customer. Okay, so when do strong arm tactics and leverage and negotiations really work for some of these OEMs? Okay, 90% of what they outsource is with a few huge suppliers. Not much leverage in that situation. 10% of what they outsource is with around 2,000 to 3,000 suppliers. All right, who are these 2,000 or 3,000 suppliers? They're mom and pops, family-owned businesses, single factory companies that are located in small to mid-sized towns that employ most of the local community. So think about that. So let's say GM decides, all right, things aren't selling, the bread and butter of our profits, trucks aren't selling, we're in a recession, or gas is $4 a gallon. Things are tight, our margins are thin. So when they go to their 100 suppliers that account for 90% of their spends, they don't have a lot of leverage in that situation. But they do have a lot of leverage when they go to the mom and pops and say, I need to reopen this contract and revisit it, and we need to do this in the short term. Now, if you're a mom and pop and GM's 75% of your business, you don't have a lot of leverage in that situation. My point is, these strong arm tactics that the OEMs sometimes use when times aren't very good and things are tight aren't effective, because they tend to only work with a small percentage of your total spend. So you go to these 2,000 or 3,000 suppliers and you basically hack away at their margins. The net cost savings isn't very much, because collectively those 3,000 suppliers might only account for 10% of your total spend. That other 90% is with these 50 to 100 companies that are going to be less reluctant to agree to you just hacking away at their margins. So that's the world you're going into. Sometimes you will be under pressure to cut costs very quickly, in which case you might resort to strong arming suppliers. In which case I would argue long term, I don't know how effective that's going to be as well. I think it's reasonable to assume that during tough times that everyone should share in the suffering, but I'm not a proponent of you being a buyer and agreeing to do business with suppliers where you know they're going to lose money on the business. So if you agree to a price and you know that the supplier is going to be losing money on that business, and you tell the supplier, don't worry, I'll get you back in a couple of years here, we'll get you a price where we restore you to profitability, and then long term here, you'll be okay. You can't make those promises and you can't write that check ahead of time. So I would argue something like that would be inappropriate, but stuff like that goes on. You know, if an OEM or a buying organization says, hey, look, we're losing money right now. We're going to put you in a situation where, yes, we understand that you're going to lose money as well, but we're in it together. That's dangerous territory. If you do that to a mom and pop located in northern Michigan that employs half the community, and you're telling the owner of that business, please do this business with us and lose money for a few months, a few weeks, a couple of years, can you promise them that they'll be okay long term? I don't think you can. So maybe you should never agree to something in the first place if you can't promise it and guarantee it. Furthermore, if I owned my own business, even if my customer was 50, 70, 80% of my customer portfolio, I don't know if I'd ever actually agreed to doing business with a customer that's agreeing to or telling me to take on the business at a loss. I don't know if I want to do business with that sort of customer. And I understand in some situations you might not have a choice, but I would argue that your long-term strategy to be get away from that customer and find new ones that would never put you in a position to do business with them and actually lose money. And that stuff happens out there. Okay, I think that's enough on this one. Hopefully I've enlightened you a little bit about what you're getting yourself into. Again, it's not tactical anymore. You got to be creative. You got to problem solve. You got to tap into soft skills and hard skills. And that's why they're paying a premium for you. That's why I don't think your jobs ever disappear. The technology out there is amazing, but that technology just does tactical stuff. And if you become a master of that technology, you can actually use it to strengthen your strategic skill sets. But you got to know how to use it. Excel's not enough. You can't just be able to make sense out of data. You got to be able to visualize it for the actual decision makers and use things like Tableau and Power BI. You have to use programming languages like Python to actually change the technology so that you get it to do what you want it to do. Just endless. You got to be everything, right? And I keep saying that over and over again, but the good thing is it'll give you enormous amounts of job security if you actually become a jack of all trades. Thank you, and I will talk to you soon.